Tonight on Nation to Nation, homelessness is at an all-time high in cities and towns across the country. Is there a solution?
We need to fill the gap with non-market, co-op, and social housing with the true cultural wraparound supports that make things like addictions and mental health accessible to Indigenous people.
A huge uptick in online mining claims in Ontario has First Nation leaders calling for a one-year pause.
A lot of First Nations don't have the manpower, especially the smaller First Nations, to be able to keep up with this, so it puts an undue burden on them.
A coroner's inquest into the mass stabbings at the James Smith Cree Nation has wrapped up. APTN's reporter was on the scene and said it was an emotional 2 weeks.
We've seen tears, we've seen people break down in the hallways. It's been a very emotional journey.
Ani, welcome to Nation. I'm Annette Francis. Canada is experiencing a homelessness crisis. Encampments have been seen in every city and town across the country. The city of Edmonton has been in the headlines quite a lot lately because police there have been tasked with clearing out encampments. Blake Desjardins is a Métis Cree and the NDP Member of Parliament in Edmonton.
We must break these cycles of violence while building safe, affordable, and supportive housing for all, and support and enact solutions brought forward by leading community organizations I know that are found in every riding in our country.
Joining me now is NDP MP Blake Desjardins. Welcome to Nation.
Always good to be here.
So the homeless crisis in Edmonton, the city of Edmonton, has reached an all-time high. We've seen the encampments being torn down and the state of the shelter spaces being maxed out as well. How do you begin to fix that?
Oh, fixing it is a huge concern that I have and one that I'm deeply vested in. But understanding how to fix the problem, I think we need to understand how that we got into the problem. This isn't the first time Canada has been in a housing crisis or a housing emergency. For Indigenous people, it's been a lifetime. But for most Canadians, they will remember a time when rent was affordable, when they can afford a home, when there was available units that were subsidized for the purpose of low-income persons. That program actually ended. The program that was built for the better part of 50 years in Canada called the National Housing Strategy, which ended in 2000 by Paul Martin in 1995. And so huge impacts because of that program. Since the February 22nd, actually, we're coming up upon the anniversary of the ending of the National Housing Strategy, we begin to start to see the loss of affordable units, the loss of low-income units, the loss of supportive units. And the outcome of that was to then have the private market deal completely and solely as the only actor in the housing market. This is the problem that we're facing in Canada today, the lack of the will of a government that wants to do the work and needs to do the work of ensuring that the right to human housing, the human right that it is to be housed, is truly met. And that means bringing back programs and significant investments like the National Housing Strategy that for the better part of Canada's history, many Canadians benefited from. Now we're stuck with both consecutive and conservative governments since that time that have reinforced this model, and now we're in a crisis where we don't have enough homes for people, we're underfunding Indigenous Services Canada, and we're seeing those direct impacts from Indigenous communities starting to filter into urban centres, and we're seeing those horrific outcomes today: encampments, addiction, houselessness. It's hurting communities. Over 300 people died last year in Edmonton alone. These were predominantly Indigenous people. Right now, as we speak, on the streets of Edmonton, there is thousands of houseless folks, over 50% of them Indigenous. This is a matter of reconciliation. It's a matter of how we treat one another, and it's a matter that must truly become an emergency and seen as an emergency, something I asked the government to do yesterday.
Indigenous people are 11 times most likely to end up homeless, and some studies suggest racism, historic trauma, and colonialism can be linked to homelessness. How do you even begin to fix those issues?
Oh, thank you for asking this question. Canada's project has largely been, for the better part of our history, one of displacement. Many Indigenous families, whether it's the young people who are hearing these stories for the first time or our elders who have to witness and feel and understand what it means to be displaced, know that there has been insidious and nefarious projects across our country like residential schools that literally took Indigenous children out of their homes they had, put them in an institution and then put them on the streets. there's direct impact like that. When I was in my community of Edmonton, Griesba, I spoke to people who were residential school survivors living in tents. I spoke to people who were 60 Scoop or CFS, and there were young children out there because they were dropped off on the street because the child and family services system we have in this country is deplorable. These systems are alive and well. The racism is alive and well. That's why we need a comprehensive national emergency on Indigenous housing. It's no secret that the impacts of these terrible colonial policies are still being felt today. We must have the courage to call it out, and we must have the courage to fix it. It means taking seriously the recommendations made by those who suffered in residential schools to the recommendations they made to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It means working with First Nations, Métis settlements, and Inuit communities to actually provide the infrastructure funding with operations and maintenance that is required to ensure that the infrastructure in those communities can actually sustain building homes. These are the kind of basic programs that should be in place in Canada. Without it, we continue this apartheid system.
And where do you begin to find the will to start that work?
In Parliament. It starts in Parliament. We have parliamentarians right now, both Conservative and Liberal, who, for example, don't want to talk about this emergency. We have Pierre Poilievre, who's very popular right now. And he's popular because he's calling out the problem. Yeah, Canadians are suffering. But in the same vein, he's not talking about solutions. And this is the problem I have with Mr. Poilievre and his approach to the housing market, is he feels that the billionaires are just going to be able to fix all the issues if we just give them a tax break. No, that's not the way it's going to go in this country, and that's not how we fixed it in the past. And the Liberals have sat largely idle and taken the position similar to the Conservatives that if we motivate the private sector, if we make richer people richer, that they will fix the problem. New Democrats and myself, we know that that's not the way forward. We can't continue that path because it results in the situation we're seeing in Toronto, in Vancouver, and across the country where people can't afford rent. They can't afford their mortgages. We need to fill the gap with non-market, co-op, and social housing with the true cultural wraparound supports that make things like addictions and mental health accessible to Indigenous people who have otherwise or may have never had exposure to those systems and those supports. It's up to us to build them. Reconciliation demands it. Our country's future demands it. And I really do think Indigenous people are there. They have the solutions and they're ready. The government needs the will, and the opposition is not making things easy.
I want to move on to Bill C-53 as well. You come from a Métis community, one that is not part of the Métis Nation of Alberta. What's your thoughts on Bill C-53? It looks like it is going to go through for a third reading. What's your thoughts on this?
Oh, I think if we had more time to speak about Bill C-53, I'd love the opportunity to. I largely feel that the perspective of Bill C-53 is one that comes out of the goodwill of Métis people, but the bad actions of a government. What I mean by bad actions of a government is that we have a political commitment, again stemming back as far as the early 2000s from the Kelowna Accord. Some in the Métis space may know this accord as a political agreement between the Liberal Party and Métis persons that gathered in Kelowna to speak about the outcomes of reconciliation, a good project and an honorable one. However, what I do believe Bill C-53 lacks is the perspective of how Métis people can assert rights or who those collectives truly are. The government has taken a legal approach to who is Métis persons by establishing, largely by its own restriction and non-recognition of Métis people. It's been forced because Métis people have been courageous and known that their rights are undeniable, but the process to which the government and the Métis have concluded have been found in the courts. We've left the question about the Métis people's future up to the courts largely, something I don't necessarily agree with. When we have the courts deciding who Métis people are, and having the federal government interpret a decision from the court, it's one step removed from those persons who would truly benefit from those rights and truly benefit from the exercising of those rights. In regards to Bill C-53, I do believe that there has to be a path forward that unites Indigenous people towards the mutual recognition of our rights and an approach that demonstrates to Canada that we won't accept a divide and conquer approach, and we won't accept the silencing of First Nations and Inuit voices who are feeling legitimately that these concerns are not being addressed. And that is the failure of a government. They should have the will to meet with First Nations and Métis partners and explain the situation that they've come to, which has largely been because of their non-recognition of Métis for so long and their lack of consultation with First Nations.
Okay, miigwech. Thank you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. Kinatskam Tinawao.
Stay tuned. After the break, we'll hear about the explosion of mining stakes in Ontario. Ani, welcome back. A flood of mining claims across Ontario has the Chiefs of Ontario pushing for a one-year moratorium on staking claims. Exploration companies and prospectors can now stake their claims online, making it difficult for First Nations to keep up with their review. 2023 marks the highest annual number of mining claims staked in Ontario over the last 6 years. The claims now number in the thousands, although Australian-based Wailu Metals owns the majority of them. The Anishinaabe Nation represents 39 First Nations, one-third of Ontario's First Nation population. Reg Niganabi is the Grand Council Chief. He joins me now. Welcome to Nation to Nation.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
According to the Chiefs of Ontario press release, over the past year, mining claims have risen as much as 30%. What does that mean for individual First Nations?
An impact on individual First Nations level means there's more mining claims coming in, so it could mean more paperwork, more follow-up with that. Certainly, a lot of First Nations don't have the manpower, especially the smaller First Nations, to be able to keep up with this, so it puts an undue burden on them. And additionally to that, if there are land claims that the First Nations are going through, this could impact them negatively in that way because it's being removed from the system there.
How surprised are you at the sheer number of those claims?
Not too much, actually. When they were switching over to this system, the electronic system that they do now, this was a concern that had come up already. They made the move anyways, and here we are now. First Nations, of course, are being inundated with so many claims now.
How would a one-year moratorium help?
It could help us get on track to how we're going to deal with a lot of this issue. We could certainly sit down and talk with the province about some of these issues, and of course the federal government also, because they also play their part within this. And the First Nations could probably come to some sort of solution. I mean, a lot of it is, the First Nations being consulted on this, on these claims, also how this process works, and being included in land ownership in these regards, making decisions for us, by us.
The province says that First Nations are being consulted. Are they?
Well, that's the thing, right? I bet the province can't confirm that either. As these mining claims come out, it's on the onus of the individual who makes the claim or stakes the claim to come into contact with the First Nation. And in a lot of instances where there's so many of these, First Nations might not be able to keep up with who's who and who's where and all these sort of things, making the claims. And are they even out on the land, or are they just doing the electronic staking and leaving it at that? All these questions need to be answered.
Your organization asked for a moratorium 2 years ago and was turned down. How confident are you the request will be approved this time?
Well, we've escalated it to another level, and of course we explore more than just that option. I mean, that's just the kind ask right now. Where it goes from here remains to be seen. But for now, that's just the ask. Of course, we're not going to let it go or let this issue slide by the wayside. It is a big issue that impacts a lot of our First Nations, so we'll be sticking to this one.
Is the Ontario Mining Act the issue, or is it the way that it's being done?
I think it's the jurisdiction that probably Ontario and the federal government assumes they have over our lands, and not including us in a lot of these discussions, a lot of these lawmaking, a lot of these regulations. There's minimal inclusion of what we ask for. Certainly we do engage with them and we do ask for certain things, but of course those things are generally pushed aside or ignored or said they're not feasible. I mean, even this right now, I imagine you've heard that putting a stop for a year is unfeasible and it can't be done. And it's not that it can't be done, it's that there's no real desire to do it.
As mentioned in the intro, Wailu Metals owns the majority of the claims and is promising jobs for Indigenous people and other benefits. What do you make of these promises?
It goes beyond just the consultation and jobs and things like that, right? Like it's more to jobs. It's more than jobs. It's the land for us is important. We only have a very little bit amount of it in terms of we don't make any more land. We just have the land that we have. So it's important to First Nations in that regard, and also to, you know, as these minds open up and these sort of things, and they progress forward, there's a question of how does that impact our traditional livelihood? How does that impact our health? Even jobs and all these other things, that has an impact and social impact on us. So there's a lot more to be considered there than what these companies are maybe viewing at this time. And certainly they need to engage with the First Nations so they become educated in those areas so they can help establish a better relationship with those First Nations.
Are First Nations, most First Nations, against development, or is it the fact that they need to have they want to have a say?
I think every First Nation is unique. They have their different reasons. Some are, of course, fully embracing development, and others want to take a slower approach to everything. Sometimes it comes at us a little too quickly, and so, you know, as First Nation people, we don't always generally just jump into something. We like to take our time, and we like to understand it, and we like to develop a relationship with whoever is coming into the territory. So that's ingrained in us. That's our traditional style of governance. So that's how it's probably going to be. But yes, there isn't a total opposition to development. These things can be talked about and discussed, and come to some median on a lot of the issues.
How soon do you expect to hear back from the province?
We haven't heard back from them yet, as far as I know. Could take a while. Sometimes it takes a month or two or whatever, depending on the severity of the issue. But we're definitely sitting and awaiting a response.
Okay, Miigwech, thank you for joining us.
Miigwech, thank you.
Stay tuned. After the break, we'll hear from APTN reporter Rachel May, who wraps up the James Smith Cree Nation inquest for us. Welcome back. A coroner's inquest into mass stabbings at the James Smith Cree Nation is currently wrapping up. In September 2022, Miles Sanderson had breached parole repeatedly and was considered unlawfully at large when he killed 11 people and injured 17. Sanderson had a lengthy criminal record, including multiple violent offenses. It left the community in a state of shock. For the past 2 weeks, there has been an inquest into the incident in Melfort, Saskatchewan. APTN reporter Rachel May has been there for the entire time. She joins me now. Welcome to Nation, Rachel May.
Thank you for having me.
The jury made 14 recommendations. Was there anything that stood out?
You know, when it comes to the 14 recommendations that were made, they touched on 4 different areas. We heard about RCMP, we heard about James Smith, we heard about Correctional Services of Canada, and we heard about the Public Safety Board. That in itself is a wide breadth of people, but what we heard from families is that we didn't hear anything about the parole board. So that's what stood out for a lot of people. There was no recommendations about parole or anything along those lines.
What are you hearing from community members? What recommendations would they like to see?
The recommendations from the community members are a lot along the lines of wanting a national inquiry. They said that this is a great step and it's been very helpful to members. They've been able to sleep better at night. They've actually had closure that they didn't get to experience before with previous information updates. So when it comes to community, they are hoping for more, but say that they're very grateful for this.
What's it been like for the community and families to go through all this trauma once again during the 2 weeks of the testimony?
It's been a lot to hear. It's been hard to hear. Jury members, family members, community members, everyone affected by this tragedy has heard some details that they won't be able to forget. We've seen tears. We've seen people break down in the hallways. It's been a very emotional journey, but they also are saying that if the deaths of their family members can bring justice for other people who may have experienced similar deaths in their family or prevent similar deaths from the future happening, then their deaths aren't in vain.
How can this help the community and elsewhere in the country where situations like this happen?
We talk about nations across the country. There are many First Nations that aren't getting the resources they need. One of the recommendations we did hear was that James Smith is being recommended to continue to find Indigenous policing in their community, to fund the security that they've had. Members are hoping that that transfers to all First Nations. People have been saying that First Nations policing is a right. It is necessary as breathing is.
So ultimately, what can the inquest do to prevent another tragedy like this?
So we've heard a lot about what we're hoping for James Smith, but a lot of family members are hoping that this brings closure to everyone who was affected. We know that this was a national-wide search. We heard that people in BC were giving reports and tips about where Miles Sanderson might be. Although those weren't truthful, not because they were unable to provide accurate accounts, that was just mistaken identity, we still see that it affected many provinces outside of Saskatchewan. So we're hoping that ultimately this inquest provides a way for Indigenous communities to come together and get the resources they need, like Indigenous policing, the security forces. These are all necessary. And we heard from Chief Coroner Clive Wayhill, who said that they're hoping that legislation changes so that we can make more of these recommendations mandatory instead of just suggestions.
You've sat through 2 weeks of this inquest. How has it affected you? And can you tell us any of the, some of the events that happened, or what you heard in there? How you will take away from it?
For myself, it's been a journey. I think everyone in that room had heard some details that are going to be very hard to forget. We heard a graphic recounting of a timeline of what exactly happened on September 4th, 2022. It started early in the morning, and we heard from RCMP officers who were first on the scene, who were seeing things that they were never trained to see, things that they were never able to come to terms with. RCMP has offered great supports to them. People in the community, we've had people who were the attacked come to the inquest, people who were in hospital for stab wounds come to the inquest to hopefully hear all of these recommendations and know that these attacks weren't in vain, that these deaths weren't in vain. So when we think of all of the cultural supports that were here, they're also hoping to implement that in further inquests. So Clive Wayhill spoke about how there was ceremony here. There was a ceremony every day. There was a teepee with a fire burning, and there was smudges that every person in attendance got a chance to take part in.
Okay, miigwech, Rachel, thank you for taking the time.
Thank you for having me.
That's it for this week's Nation to Nation. And if you missed any part of tonight's show, you can check out our podcast. Go to aptnnews.ca/podcast. Miigwech, and have a good night.